The adjustment tools available here in Photos could very well be what you use most often while in edit mode. Adjustments let you improve the brightness, colors, and details of images. So with the Adjust button selected up here, over in the sidebar we get the full list of available adjustments. Click on the turn down triangle next to the adjustment's name to view the basic controls of that adjustment. Some adjustments have a second Options turn down triangle that provides access to even more controls. Notice that when I move the main slider here for the light adjustment, its optional sliders also react. To the right of the adjustment title is a Reset button that will reset only this adjustment. We also have an Auto button for many adjustments that, when clicked, will let Photos choose what it feels is the best setting for that adjustment depending on the image. Any applied adjustment has a blue circle filled in next to its name. Click this to hide the results of that adjustment in the image. So I could apply an automatic black and white adjustment to this photo, but then click the Hide button to remove the black and white effect from the image and continue working with other adjustments. The Reset button at the bottom of the sidebar will reset every adjustment that's been applied to an image, whether it's currently visible or not. From the View menu, we can choose to show the histogram, which is basically a graph of the image in red, green, and blue. The further to the left these high points are, the darker the photo will be. As I move the light slider to the left, the histogram contents also move that way, telling me that they're getting darker. Go too far and some might begin falling off the graph. This is called clipping, which in a photo displays as solid black areas with no detail. Clipping at the opposite end of the histogram creates solid white areas. So having the histogram up while you're performing adjustments can be a really helpful guide. We can also enter an exact number for these optional adjustments. The range is from -1 to 1, so we always start at 0. Just hover over a slider and double-click on the number here to enter. Usually I prefer to just use the slider, which provides instant feedback within the photo and in the histogram. Through the next several lessons, we're going to take a look at each adjustment individually to see how they affect certain parts of a photo. We'll start with the light adjustment. The light adjustment will let you not just adjust the overall light and dark of an image, but specific areas of light and dark as well. Notice that when I move the main light adjustment slider, that I can go all the way to either end, and the image is still viewable at either extreme. It's not completely blown out at the light end, or just all black at the dark end. Photos is performing an overall change to the image using all 7 optional sliders available for the light adjustment. None of these sliders get moved to their extremes despite the overall adjustment going to its max in either the light or dark direction. Let's reset this and take a look at the optional light adjustments. First, we have brilliance. This will brighten dark areas, but gradually reduce highlights as well. And it's going to add some contrast to reveal hidden detail. Notice that if I reduce brilliance, the light area of the clouds here increases, while the lightness of the landscape decreases. Exposure will adjust the overall tone of the entire image. All darks and all light areas are affected. The highlight and shadow sliders only affect those areas of an image. So if I increase the highlights by dragging the slider to the right, only the light area of the images get lighter. Drag it to the left and the light areas become darker. Doing this will often bring out details in the light area, especially if the exposure or brightness has already been increased. Decrease the shadows and the dark areas in the clouds and on the mountains becomes darker. Increasing shadows will lighten up the dark areas, often bringing out more detail. But increase this too much and the image starts to become washed out. The highlights and shadows sliders can be really useful, but normally need to be used subtly. The brightness slider will basically apply a white or black cast onto the image. I tend to prefer to use the exposure adjustment rather than brightness. When I drag the contrast slider, the histogram will spread out, indicating higher contrast. Or it will contract towards the center, which puts all the colors in one area of medium brightness, resulting in a washed out, very gray looking image. Increasing the contrast too much, and the dark areas start clipping, resulting in solid blacks without any detail in some areas. Adjusting the black point looks similar to the shadows adjustment, but the slider is reversed. We can look at the histogram to see the difference. Decreasing the black point has a similar effect on the image as boosting the shadows. But notice that adjusting the black point is more of an absolute. It forces the entire histogram over from its edge, whereas the shadows adjustment makes a much more gradual change in the histogram. Moving the black point adjusts the overall tonal level of the image, setting where black begins. You certainly won't need to adjust all of these for every photo. For most, you may just use the main light adjustment slider. But knowing what each of the optional sliders can do can help you get just the look that you want from an image. Next, we'll look at the color adjustment. The color adjustment has three optional control sliders within it: saturation, contrast, and cast. Use the main color slider to boost or reduce the overall colors and color contrast in an image. The saturation slider alone will increase the amount of color in the image. Any part of the photo with color gets more color. In this photo, the blues in the sky and water really come out, along with the green and yellow in the mountainside vegetation, as well as the color in the rocks at the top of the mountain. Reducing the saturation will eventually make all the colors a shade of gray. Contrast in the color adjustment is not the same as contrast in the light adjustment. This only refers to contrast within colors. A good example of this can be shown in the blue sky. As I increase the color contrast here, the gradient within the sky becomes more apparent. Reduce the color contrast, and the blues and greens become more and more flat. Usually, a combination of increases in saturation and color contrast can make an image sort of pop off the screen a bit more. The cast control is a color correction tool. Move the slider left for more of a blue cast to the image, and to the right for a yellow cast. On average, this will be needed more for indoor flash photos. In this image, we can move the slider a little to the left to accentuate the blue. I don't use cast very often, especially now that Photos has a white balance and selective color controls, both of which we're going to look at later on. Next up, we have black and white. Next, we have the black and white adjustment. As soon as I move the black and white slider, the image is converted to grayscale. Adjusting this slider varies the tone and contrast of the image. 4 option sliders are available in the black and white adjustment. First is intensity. Reduce this for a flatter and less contrasted image. As I increase intensity, the darks in the clouds and mountains get heavier. The neutral slider adjusts the brightness of the neutral gray tones in the image. Focus on the valley areas in this photo. As I reduce the neutrals, they get darker, and increase to lighten. Tone also affects the contrast of the light and dark grays in the image. pushing them more towards white and black when increased. Notice the histogram when adjusting the tone. Reduce the tone to compress the histogram, and increase it to spread it out, boosting contrast. The grain slider will let you introduce a certain amount of graininess to the image. I'm going to zoom in a little here, and you can see the grain being added. This can be good for adding a retro or worn effect to a black and white image. Of course, we can quickly turn the black and white adjustment off using the blue checkmark button. But while the light and color effects are active, they can also affect the look of the black and white adjustments. Moving the exposure, highlight, or shadow sliders can all have a significant effect on the look of the black and white image. The same goes for the color adjustments. So all these adjustments can be used together to get just the right look in a photo, whether it's black and white or full color. The Retouch tool is the only brush tool in photos. The size of the brush can be adjusted by dragging this slider or using the bracket keys. For the tool to work, the brush icon here must be gray. There are two ways to use the Retouch tool. You can either just click and drag over an area that you want to remove or repair, or you can option click on a source area of the image and use that source information to repair or replace a different area. I'll start with option 1. In the sky here, there are some wispy clouds that I'd like to remove. So I can set my brush size and just paint over the clouds to remove them. It might not work perfectly the first try, but it's easy to either go over again or undo and take another shot at it. The smaller the brush, the better the detail the repair is going to be. This will also work well removing some of the shrubs out in the valley. But if I try to remove some that are more up in the foreground, it doesn't work very well. For these, it's going to work better if I sample an area without shrubs and paint over what I want to remove. To sample, hold down the Option key. This does a good job over on this slope as well. The Retouch tool is not something you're going to use to remove or clone complex objects, but it does work very well for getting rid of small objects or repairing blemishes. The Red Eye tool works in a similar way as the Retouch tool does. It's just built to fix only one specific blemish, red eye. Or nowadays, with different flashes, you might get green eye or white eye. To repair red eye, just make sure the brush icon is gray and adjust the brush size to be only slightly larger than the pupil you're correcting. Then just click. So I just did this manually, but it can be taken care of even faster with a single click of the Auto Red Eye button here. Photos is able to locate the eyes and fix the issue by itself. The white balance adjustment is a color correction tool that allows you to adjust the photo's overall color or cast. Color cast can be caused by lighting conditions, a flash, or just being taken in a certain location. There are 3 different types of white balance adjustments available: neutral gray, skin tone, and temperature and tint. I can manually adjust the sliders of each of these as I select them in the menu. But the way to really get the best results with these tools is to use the eyedropper. So with neutral gray selected, I need to select the eyedropper and then click on a neutral gray area in this photo. A good spot for that in this photo would be on the wall back here in the shadowy area. That makes a very minor correction. To show something more drastic, this time I'm going to use the eyedropper on a non-neutral gray area, which in this case will be on the wall again, but where the lamp is throwing out a lot of yellow light. Click here and the white balance tool adjusts that location to a neutral gray tone, also affecting the rest of the colors in the image, in this case poorly. So if I do this one more time but click on the shadow area again, or even on the cat's gray fur, the white balance will be correct again. We can use the same process in the temperature and tint menu. I still need to use the eyedropper on a neutral gray area. After using the eyedropper, you might want to then manually make subtle adjustments with the sliders. Now let's use the skin tone white balance adjustment in this photo. All we need to do is select skin tone in the menu, and then with the eyedropper, click on a skin tone. I usually like to use a cheek. That brings some more color into his skin. It might have actually brought a little too much color back in, so I can reduce it slightly using the slider. The levels adjustment gives us finer control of the tonal range and contrast in an image. Many of the changes that can be made in levels can also be done with the optional sliders in the light and color adjustments. Displaying the levels adjustment again shows us the histogram. Here in the menu, the luminance and RGB options are going to affect the full image and are only going to change the type of graph presented in the histogram. I usually prefer to leave this as RGB. Below we can then select individual colors to adjust. We're going to start with RGB selected, and as I mouse over the histogram, we get 4 main control points. From left to right, there are black point, shadows, midtones, highlights, and white point. So if I drag the black point in, the amount of areas that are pure black in the image is going to increase. Move the white point in, and the amount of pure white in the image increases. To increase highlights, move its slider in. To decrease, move it out to the right. For shadows, it's the opposite. Slide in to increase the shadows and out to lighten the shadows. So basically, it's slide left to lighten and slide right to darken. The midtone slider works the same way, but notice that the shadows and highlight sliders move along with it. So the midtones affect much more of the image than moving only the shadows or highlight sliders. We can also move the top nodes of the shadows, midtones, and highlight sliders. They're the opposite though. Slide right to lighten, slide left to darken. A general rule of thumb when doing a levels adjustment is to move the black and white points in to where the histogram starts going up. If you bring these too far in, clipping begins to occur, which means areas of total black and total white will occur more and more. Moving the shadows and highlight sliders in towards the center is going to increase the overall contrast in the image. Now let's switch the menu to only affect the reds in this image. We get the same sliders, but rather than affecting the overall tones, we're only affecting red tones within the shadows, midtones, and highlights of the image. Slide left to boost the reds, right to decrease. Use the shadow slider to only adjust the reds in the darker areas of the image. If I move this in a bit, and then switch to green and move its shadow slider out a bit, the greens in the valley get a nice boost. The effects of adjusting the individual colors will vary from image to image, but doing so can really change the overall look or mood of a photo. A little trial and error with levels can often end up with some great results. Curves perform similar tasks as levels does, but with a different interface. With curves, we can work right on the histogram. I can click on the line going through the graph here to begin adjusting the image. If I place a node right about in the center, then move up and to the left, the image is going to brighten. Go down and right to darken. Multiple nodes can be placed on this line. Create an S-curve like this to increase contrast. Drag a node off the edge of the histogram to remove it. In the bottom left corner, we can adjust the black point, just like in levels. In the lower right corner, we can move the white point. Use the eyedroppers up here to set the black, mid-gray, and white point for an image with one click. This image doesn't have any really black areas, so when I click with the black point eyedropper, even on the darkest area of this photo, it moves the black point way too much. The eyedroppers work better when choosing the gray point or the white point in this example. We can also add a node to the histogram with this target tool. Click on any point in the image, and it's going to be added on the histogram. We can then move this node to affect exactly the tones that we want to in the image. With the RGB menu up here, we can adjust only certain colors. I can still use the target tool to add a node, then adjust only the greens. Moving the node up boosts the greens, which look good in the valley, but the greens were also boosted in the clouds. So if I add another node over here in the highlights area of the histogram and reduce the green, it brings the clouds back to looking more realistic. Go too far though and they start looking red. So by using nodes on the histogram, the eyedroppers, and the targeting tool, you can make extreme or very subtle color adjustments or corrections with the Curves tool. The definition adjustment can make an image more crisp and clear without overdoing the contrast and creating blown out white areas or jagged edges, like some sharpening tools can do. Definition is going to enhance shape and contour in a photo. It just has this single slider, or we can use the auto button. The adjustment works well in this image, adding a bunch of detail. If you've used dehaze filters in other apps, definition will have a similar effect. In this image, adding definition reduces the haze in the background, while also sharpening up the wildflowers in the foreground. Being just a single slider, the definition adjustment is great to quickly try out on a photo, just to see what it can add. Next up, we'll look at Selective Color. Selective Color is a powerful tool and a great addition to the editing mode here in Photos. There are 7 preset colors here to choose from, or we can choose a specific color from the image with the eyedropper. I'll start by selecting the yellows. Now in the sliders below, I can adjust only the yellows in the image. With the hue slider, we can make the yellows more green or more magenta. Use saturation to adjust the intensity of the selected color, and luminance to adjust its brightness. The range slider will let you either decrease how many shades of yellow are affected, or increase it to affect more yellows. I'm going to tweak the reds in this image a bit as well. Reducing the range for both of these colors will avoid moving the shade of the color in the sky too much. Now let's jump over to this image of tulips. Rather than adjusting one of the preset colors, let's use the eyedropper to select a specific color from the image. The color that I select will take the spot of the currently selected color here. So when doing this, it's good to choose the color closest to what you're planning to select. For this one, that could be red or magenta. I'll stick with magenta. Then I'm going to grab the eyedropper and select the color in one of the tulip petals. That color is added to the palette here, and I can now adjust its sliders. I'm going to do the same for the green leaves. Digital noise will usually appear in photos taken in low light. Noise shows up as a grainy or speckled look in the photos. In this image, I need to zoom in quite a bit to see the noise. It's most apparent in the darker areas of the sky. If I were to make a large print of this image, the noise here would probably show up. But increase the noise reduction slider, and this graininess is reduced. Notice that we also have an auto button here, but from what I can tell, this will always move the slider to 1. So it's not examining the image and determining if it needs a certain amount of noise reduction. In this case, auto just moves the slider to a certain number every time. For this image, we need to go to about 1.5 to see a noticeable noise reduction. Now let's move to an image with a face in it. We have some pretty bad noise speckles here. The noise reduction slider will reduce these, but it also decreases the detail. Moving the slider up really softens his eyes and other facial features. So noise reduction is often balanced with how much detail you want to lose. Both of these images so far have been JPEG files, which we can see up in the info window. If you're working with a raw image file, such as this one, we get 3 sliders in the noise reduction adjustment. .arw is Sony's raw file format. The format out of your camera might be different. So we have 2 noise reduction sliders here. Luminance, which will deal with brightness, and color. In this image, reducing the color noise has the most effect, but adding a luminance noise reduction also helps. Utilizing these two in combination should give you better results than the single noise slider on non-RAW files. The Details slider will attempt to bring back or retain details lost from noise reduction. In this image, the cloud silhouettes here benefit from bringing back a little detail. The Sharpen adjustment provides 3 sliders: Intensity, Edges, and Fall Off. The Intensity slider will adjust the strength of the sharpened edges. The Edges slider will adjust how many pixels near an edge are included in the sharpening. Essentially, it makes the edges larger or smaller. And fall off is kind of a sharpening booster. Decreasing the slider will make the sharpening effect less severe, or you can increase it to boost the sharpening effect. So if I zoom in on the leaves in this photo, as I increase the intensity, notice the edge of this leaf becomes more prominent because the white in the edge is gaining contrast. Increase the edges slider, and the small veins in the leaf start to pop more. Use the fall off slider to fine-tune the overall sharpening adjustment. The sharpening adjustment can bring out more detail and add crispness to a photo, but you need to be careful not to overdo it and end up with blown out or jagged edges. The vignette adjustment lets us add a black or white area of color to the corners of an image. The strength slider controls whether the vignette's going to be black or white. Drag left for white and right for black. The further we move the slider, the stronger the vignette's going to appear. Move the radius slider to the right for the vignette to cover more of the photo. Slide it left to keep the vignette up in the corners. Adjusting the softness can provide a very gradual fade to the vignette, or it can be a sharper transition from the image to the vignette. So with full strength and radius sliders, and the least softness, we can pretty much make a circle around these otters. Vignettes usually work best in portraits, or in photos where you want to focus the attention on the subject that's close to the center of your image. I also find that vignette looks best in black and white images.